The Meritocratic Manifesto. Opening proposition: everywhere we look in this world, but more specifically, in our nations, there is graft, corruption and greed. But in a few places, we see another reality. In this other reality, there is love, charity and compassion. But love, charity and compassion are a cruel joke, if the ones doing the giving are not the ones doing the work. Love, charity and the other good things, are made possible because of the work done that builds communities. It is work that makes charity possible. It is work that builds civilization. But if you are only doing charity without doing the work, charity itself is a negative factor. Third-person charity tears down what others were trying to build. But how do we identify and isolate the negative aspects of charity while accentuating the positive elements? To answer this, we must look at two other phenomena. There is another pair of factors that we need to compare. There is nature in its raw state. For animals and plants, nature is everything they need. They are part of nature and nature is part of them. For man, nature is as much a threat to life, as it is life. When we study nature, we find there is little in nature that is useful to man, not in its raw state, not in the way we find it in nature. We have air to breathe and water to drink and a sky to sleep under, but not much else in nature comes to us without a struggle. Nature in its raw state is not friendly to us. But there is also logic and analytical reasoning. These things have no downside. Indeed, the more they are employed the better of society is. The finding is that our communities ought to be based on logical reasoning, not power reflecting the natural world. Man ought not strive to embed himself in nature, but to rise above it. Our finding is that there are two paths available to us, the natural and the synthetic. The synthetic is always created and requires work to bring about. The natural operates according to the law of the jungle, the synthetic and artificial is grounded in logic and morality. If we choose the path set out by nature, we must live by the law of the jungle, in a war of all against all. Humans cannot survive in this kind of environment for long. Man must mature, spiritually. He needs to become Christian, build an environment designed by him for his needs. The need to work. Nature is not the natural environment for man. We cannot develop and live in caves, wrestling with nature for sustenance. Because nature is inimical to our human needs, there is a need to work. There is a need to process nature into more and more usable form. This is ordained by Scripture. We can minimize the effort we put out. We can live as close to nature as is feasible, while staying alive. When we do this, when we live primarily on the fruits of nature, we live in what is called a subsistence culture. Subsistence basically means, those in a subsistence culture live on the edge of starvation. It is not because we will not work, that we live in a subsistence culture. We still need to work, but those who do not build civilizations, do not trust. Trust is what is missing in poor areas, and it is what is stronger in richer regions. Trust is of course faith. Without faith there is no free market nor the specialization that leads to progress. If we do not have faith and do not trust, we consume what we produce. A people with no faith live hand to mouth. There is no accumulation of assets. This lack of trust is the reason for what is called a subsistence culture. Subsistence cultures live hand to mouth. What is produced is consumed because otherwise it will be stolen. There is some sharing that happens, as a kind of delayed reciprocity. Tom gives away his surplus today, because he expects the village to reciprocate sometime in the future. Subsistence cultures subsist, they do not progress. They do not progress because deep down there is no trust between members. Because there is no trust, they do not expose themselves to risk. What they share would probably spoil, if not given away. There is also the risk that what they stored would be stolen. There is no law to protect ownership rights, and so amassing property would likely bring the wrath of their poorer neighbors down on them. So, any surplus is given away. There is the expectation that a gift will be reciprocated, at some later date, but there is no guarantee. The point is, there is zero capacity to accumulate property and therefore, no ability to progress or build a civilization. Why specialize, when specialization exposes you to greater risk? The rest of the tribe do not do well enough to trade their surplus. The need to specialize. But a culture in which it is permitted to amass capital, is trust taken to the next level. It is precisely what so many cultures do not permit and why none of these cultures can achieve takeoff velocity, the point at which development becomes self-perpetuating. but even more importantly, is the trust that encourages specialization. No culture that does not prioritize the increase in specialization will develop to the level at which civilization is possible. It is one thing to amass capital, it is another thing to defend it. In the old days of the caravans, the rich merchants would band together in mutual defense pacts. If a strong man captures a fishing hole, or quarry or a fertile piece of farmland, that is one thing. Property can be protected to some extent, by strong men or by groups of strong men. But when it comes to specialization, it takes a lot to perfect a craft. If the benefits of learning to master the craft does not result in a higher level of reward, what point is there in mastering a craft? Interestingly, one of the first crafts or skills to be specialized in was witchcraft and political craft, though to some extent prostitution was also practiced. When the state came about, property could be better protected. Skills could be practiced, because the state was prepared to protect its subjects from the predatory practices of just about anyone, other than itself. The state always reserved to itself the right to override any private claims to property and wealth. The state always exercises the right to predatory expropriation. Regardless, all progress is the result of specialization. All progress is the result of one man standing up against conventional wisdom and traditional methods. One man decides there is a better way of doing something, or a better way of understanding something. All progress begins with one mind and a unique thought. Someone thinks something no one thought before. However, the innovator above all others needs his contribution protected. Otherwise, how can specialization and progress be achieved? Ownership only makes sense only if the specialist has a right to what he produces, which he does. If he does not, who does? If no one, then the result is a war of all against all, and innovation is what will suffer the most. Until the innovator and creator guarantee to what he or she produces, progress will be limited. The right of ownership. There is either a right of ownership or not. If there is no right of ownership, there is no ownership. The rift between groups, the major one, is the division between what we think about ownership. One group are socialists and think everything is owned by everyone, equally or as the state decides. The other group believes that what we create is what we own. But unless we accept there is a right to ownership vested in the individual, the idea of graft, corruption and the errors of socialism and parasitism is hard to justify. If there is no right of ownership, how can it be wrong to take whatever you can get? However, we can make a few observations. Number 1, no one created the world, and no one can claim any part of it, but God. Number 2, if you deny God, you still cannot claim you have any right to the planet. If you deny God, what you are left with is natural law. This is also known as the law of the jungle. Without God, might makes right, in the end justifies the means. It is useless trying to claim you have morality without God, because the only way you can enforce your moral laws is through superior physical force. If your moral code is dependent on the law of the jungle for enforcement, you have no moral code. Number 3, if we believe in God, we have grounds for establishing an unbreakable right of ownership. If God owns all assets because he is the author of all of physical reality, then we own all equity, the value plus added to assets, because value is created by a human mind. There is only 2 possible kinds of property and only 2 possible classes of owners. The creator and the freeloader are the only possible claimants, regardless of the particular type of property. But if we deny the right of the creator to what he or she created, there are no conditions for ownership, other than the law of the jungle. We either have a right to what we create, or we have no rights other than what our guns and muscles can give us. But if the jungle is allowed to prevail, why would there be any but the most minimal development? If we can neither guarantee our ownership nor our ability to pass it down to our progeny, why would we put a lot of time and energy into developing anything? But once we have denied God, how do we establish the rights of the creator to what he or she originated? The creator in this sense, being the innovator and workman. It is not possible. Once we deny God, we deny all of the solutions and options he makes available. Everything God has given us requires respect for the rights of the creator, and this is especially God's rights to everything he created. The paradox of salvation. This world is not complicated. Satan makes it seem complicated, but nothing truly is. The fact is, everything fundamental comes in the form of a choice. We can obey God or not. We can live in physical reality or logical reality. We can choose truth or to lie. We can remain immature or mature. We can live as flesh, or spirit. The choice is always ours. It is when we choose not to obey God, that things get complicated. But we need to analyze the situation carefully, because the complications of Satan have overlaid the simple truths of God. Over time these simple truths have become difficult to understand. The problems we have, all go back to the fact that there are only two responses to the question of ownership. Either the originator owns what he created, or we live under some form of socialism. If it is the latter, then everything is communally owned. What exists is shared, usually according to the needs of the state. But because it is important, let's repeat it again. The only options we can logically have, is for those who create the wealth to own the wealth, or for all the wealth to be shared with and often by parasites. This is the only choices we have, and oddly, the vast majority agree with the last option. Every one of our problems is tied up in an inverse relationship between parasites and apologists. We either combat parasitism, as apologists, or we enable it. We also need to relate parasitism to a condition called spiritual immaturity. Spiritual immaturity begins as physical immaturity but does not always end, when physical immaturity ends. To be saved is to acquire maturity as a spiritual being. But how does one gain spiritual maturity in a nursery? There is a path to maturity, and it is the path of apologetics. One must earn or acquire merit to acquire maturity. This is not as difficult as it might seem. One only adds more value to the world than they consume. One becomes, rather than a cost. It sounds easy, but it is always a question of how much do we cost the world, relative to the thing we do for the world. That defines our level of merit. What is needed is a way to track costs and income. This is something few seem to understand. But this failure to realize we need a way to track real costs, to have a meritocracy, is why so few people truly understand what a church is, let alone how important it is. We need a platform on which to work. There has to be a foundation on which to establish a measuring system. In apologetics, that platform is the church. It is simply a matter of abiding by the rules of ownership. The church as the representative of God on earth holds and trusts the things of God. This is the assets of the natural world. Apologists work for the church and add value to it. This grows the church and makes us a light to the world. That is all there is to it, really. The believer creates more value than he or she consumes. This gives the believer merit. Those who generate the most value for the church, have the most value in the church. That defines merit, and it explains how to create a meritocracy.